So, you want to speak spoken English, right? I get a lot of questions like this from students who want to know how to learn and speak English better, more fluently, proficiently, how to speak in English like a native speaker. So, this is what we're going to talk about in today's video. We're going to talk about the 3 phases of speaking in English, learning to speak English. It's just like learning to sing a song, and we've got a series of exercises that you can model. You can download and print this worksheet off on the site. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video to let it load up for a bit, while you download that, print that off, grab yourself a cup of coffee or some Coke, and have a seat so we can chat. You can go ahead and do that now. Okay, so welcome back to exlenglish.com. My name is David, for those of you who don't know me. We are talking about the plain English method, the scientific formula for English learning success, how you can become a top English speaking maven by using your daily praxis. Okay, so we've covered these in the last few videos. If you haven't seen those yet, later you can go back and watch those and download the worksheets for those as well. So the plain English basically stands for P-L-A-N-E. Each of those words stands for something very specific. But today we're going to be focusing on your speaking skills specifically, because most people who come to us looking for help want to become fluent and proficient English speakers. Oftentimes they can read and write well, however they have trouble speaking. So this is what we're going to talk about in today's video. Like I mentioned, basically, learning to speak English is just like learning to sing a song. And there's 3 phases. So let's use the example of the song, okay? Let's say you're driving down the road in your car, you've got the radio on, and you hear this really awesome song, and you love it. Now, as soon as that song's done, you can't just turn off the radio and immediately start singing that song on your own. Just like you can't say, I'm going to learn English, listen to, a CD and immediately start speaking English. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. But it's not as complicated as most people make it sound. So if you want to learn that song, what do? You get a copy of the song, either you buy the CD or the MP3, and you start listening to it. Okay, as you're listening to it, you're learning the song. And you listen to it a few times to familiarize yourself with the melody, the rhythm, the lyrics. And after you hear it a few times, then you can start singing along with it. You're imitating what you're hearing. You're imitating the song and you're singing along with the band, right? And so you sing along with it several times as you continue to learn it, practice it, and eventually you get to the point where you can turn off, the song CD and just sing the song. You can produce it on your own. So for example, musicians or people who are singing in a choir, what do? They get the song, they listen to it, they imitate it, they sing along, and eventually they get to the point where they can produce it on their own, singing a solo. Same thing with your English. For you to learn to speak, you've got to listen to the language, the vocabulary, the structures, the pronunciation of those words, so that you understand how it sounds, and you imitate it, you practice what you're hearing, and eventually you get to the point where you can produce it on your own. You can speak the language just like somebody learning to sing a song. So those are the 3 phases: listen, imitate, and produce it on your own. So let's go ahead and talk about those briefly here. Okay, so when you're listening to the song, basically, you're going to listen to what you're hearing in English. You're going to be listening, you're going to be hearing those new vocabulary words, how they're pronounced, the idiomatic expressions, the phrasal verbs, how everything flows together so that you can, learn English, right? And this is what happens with a lot of students who come to us, like we said, they read and write very well, but they can't speak. If you think about it, it's actually listening to what a child hears is the first things, children learn, because you don't take a young child and say, look, my child, I have 2 daughters, I didn't teach them. This is how you conjugate the verb to be, right? Kids don't learn that way. You show them, hey, this is a remote control, this is a cell phone, this is a stapler, and they begin to associate the words that they're hearing with the objects that they're seeing, and then they hear how those are used and structured and pronounced, and they begin to imitate what they hear. They, they begin speaking, they repeat after you, they'll repeat it several times and practice it until they can begin to produce it on their own in phrases and sentences to express themselves, which is the same thing you want to do learning to speak English. So oftentimes people will come like doctors, who they can read complete medical manuals. There's a lot of medical jargon, words that I don't even understand, but they understand everything they read. But they can't express themselves when they want to talk. For example, even, information technicians that I've talked to, or people who've studied a lot about the language, they've developed specific skills like reading and writing, translating, and they know the grammar rules. But when we go to talk, what happens? I say something in English, and they have to stop to try to translate it in their mind and understand what they heard, and then remember all the grammar rules so they can form their sentences and then be able to answer me. And that may take a minute or so, which totally kills their fluency. When you learn how to speak English, implicitly by, listening, imitating, and producing the language on your own, you learn it, internalize it. You don't even really have to think about what you're going to say. You're already thinking in English and you begin to speak. And that's a whole other topic, thinking in English, which we'll be covering here shortly. There's a series of exercises that we're developing to help you begin to think in English. But that's basically what you're doing. If you just stick right now with these 3 things, listening to the language, imitating what you're hearing, and producing it on your own, you'll have your basis pretty much covered. So like I said, this is really, really important if you want to speak English fluently and well. So as you're listening to the language, for example, what can you do? You can take a dialogue or a story. That's basically how people communicate. We talk with each other, or we tell stories. For example, you say, yesterday I went to the store and I saw so-and-so, or you say, yesterday I was in school and this happened, or whatever, So that's how people communicate in their day-to-day lives. Stories are awesome because they give you a framework. Within that story, you've got the vocabulary words that you're going to be learning. You've got the context they're used in, the way the structures perform, the grammar, so to speak. And you've also got the pronunciation of those words. So you can find, a podcast, for example, or a children's story with the transcripts for you to follow along with. And as you listen to it, you can follow along with the text and learn those words, use your dictionary. A lot of them you'll pick up from the context itself. And then as you learn those things while you're listening to them, the way they're pronounced, then you can begin to follow along and imitate what you're hearing. Now, obviously, right in the beginning, you're not just going to be able to take that text, listen to it, and simultaneously repeat it, because it'll probably be too fast for you. There will be specific sounds that you'll have trouble pronouncing, ways of forming the sentences that you won't be used to. So as you imitate slowly using these exercises that we're going to show you, it'll help you build up your speed. For example, in the classroom, I'll tell a story. The students will hear it. They'll understand maybe 50% of it. And then as we go back through several times, they begin to understand more and more of that story. Like maybe the second time I tell it, they'll understand 70%. And by the third time, they'll have understood most of the story. There'll be, the words that they don't know yet, or the structures that they aren't familiar with. And so then as we go through that and work through that and break it down, and they retell the story or they follow along with me, there's specific sentences where they'll get their tongue twisted up, kind of like in a tongue twister. And so then we'll work on those specific sentences, phrases, until they can say them smoothly. So let's go ahead and take a look at your audio exercise model. There are 16 different exercises here that you can use. We're going to cover 12 today that are basically for developing your speaking skills. So if you're looking at that now, you'll see the first one is the whole text listening drill. This is, like we said, the first phase where you're just listening to it. You'll see in parentheses it says listen. So basically the first thing you're going to do is just listen to your audio, the story or the dialogue or whatever, podcast you have. Once you do that, then there's the short phrase imitation drills, mimicry drills, okay? So there's A and B. Now the difference is that if there are phrases that you have trouble pronouncing, then go ahead and listen to it, 3 times. You can break it down, listen to it, go back, repeat it, and then listen to it again. There's, drill B is just where you listen to it once. If you don't have a lot of trouble with it, just go through and practice them briefly just to remember, refresh your memory, and then continue on. But if there's specific sentences that you notice, especially what I like to do is I'm working through the stories with the students, and, we just go through each sentence briefly. But if there's a specific sentence that they have trouble with, we'll underline it, mark it, and then come back for review later. But basically, you just break the sentence down into chunks, okay? So if there's a long sentence, you'll break down each section, repeat it a few times, and move on to the next phrase and as you work through the whole sentence. If they don't have a whole lot of trouble with it, then you can use the complete sentence drills. A and B, the same thing. Drill A, you repeat it several times. Drill B, just repeat it once if you don't have that much trouble. But instead of doing short phrases, breaking your sentences down into chunks, you just say the whole sentence. A lot of sentences the students will be able to breeze right through. They will say normally, naturally, not perfectly, but it's pretty smooth, so we'll just continue right on with a complete sentence. However, if they're having a lot of difficulty, that's where we'll go back and really break it down into the short phrases, okay? Especially if you're just beginning, if you're just starting off, then start off with the short phrases, and as time goes on, you won't have to take so much time practicing. You can do the complete sentences and then just focus on breaking down the sentences that give you the most trouble. There's the inverted exercise drill. This is imitation as well. A lot of times what happens is when students are saying a sentence, especially if you're breaking it down into the phrases, if you're just starting out, we'll say like, I live in Brazil. So if we're saying I live, the students will say I live, and then in Brazil, and break it down that way. So by starting off backwards and building up, you'll take in Brazil, and then live in Brazil, and then I live in Brazil, and that way they learn the correct intonation and pronunciation of the language. So if you're having trouble with the intonation, after you've worked through your chunks, the phrases, and the complete sentences, you can say them smoothly, then just go back through and go through them backwards so that you learn the correct intonation. There's completion exercises where you listen to the first part of your sentence and then pause it and continue, and then you say the rest of what you've heard, okay? So if you've listened to the text several times, you kind of know what the end of the sentence is, or if you've got your transcript, you can follow along with it there. So this is where you're hearing part of it and you're completing the rest of it. So we've got the fill in the blank exercises. This is also kind of pre-production. The third phase, just like the completion exercise that we just saw, just instead of saying, the first half and then you completing it, this part, you'll hear a part, there'll be a space, and then there'll be a completion, and you fill in the blanks with the right word or phrase. This is just extra practice. And then finally, there's the simultaneous production drill. After you've gone through several of these exercises, you can say the text smoothly, retell the story or the dialogue or whatever it is, and then you just listen to it. As you're listening to it, you're repeating out loud with the story. This is interesting because there's a theory that states that, a lot of times people have trouble speaking because they want to translate everything in their mind, right? So a lot of times you're thinking in your mother tongue, and then you have to translate and speak it into the language that you're learning, in this case, English, and so that kills that fluency, causes a pause. So the theory is that if you're doing several different things at once, activating different parts of your brain, that your brain doesn't have time to translate things. So if you're listening to a text in English, to an audio in English, you're reading along with a text and you're repeating it, you're using 3 different skills at one time, you're overstimulating your brain, and your brain won't have time to translate what you're hearing, and that will force your brain to begin thinking in English. So another quick tip there for you, just something interesting that you'd probably like to know. I haven't actually proven this, and I don't think anybody has, but it's an interesting theory to consider and think about. Okay, so the simultaneous production drill, like, when you've got the song you're imitating along, you're going to say what you're hearing as you hear it and follow along with your transcript. In the final phase of production, you're going to repeat the whole text alone, okay? So you aren't even listening to the audio, you're just following along, you're just reading your transcript aloud, or if you can even say it, don't even worry about reading it. If you're retelling a story, for example, just retell the story in your own words. An example of when I saw how powerful this was when I first started teaching. I had heard about the storytelling stuff, but I don't think I had actually started using it yet. I had some material, I'd been reading about it, and I went with my wife to visit a friend of hers who had just had a baby, and the lady had the baby that had just been born, and she had 2 other kids. Her daughter was probably around 5 or 6, and her son was maybe 2 or 3 years old. And while I was sitting there on the couch visiting with my wife's friend, the little girl came up, her daughter, the oldest daughter, and said, hey, I was watching TV the other day, and the teacher wanted to scare the kids, and she had a mask on, and she ripped off the mask, and she threw it on the ground. And so everybody kind of laughed, chuckled like adults do when children tell a story. And her brother, the younger boy, came up and said, hey, the teacher ripped off her head and threw it on the floor. So we all laughed again, and the little boy went off to play. A little bit later, the boy came back and said, hey, the teacher ripped off her head and threw it on the floor. And so everybody laughed again. It was still funny, but not as funny. And the little boy just kept doing this. Like every 5 minutes, he would come up to me, tap me on the knee, and say, hey, the teacher ripped off her head and threw it on the floor. And it got kind of irritating after a while. By the end, nobody was really laughing. They're just like, yeah, okay, kid, whatever. And then he'd go off and play. And later, after I got home and I was thinking about it, analyzing how children learn, that's exactly the way children learn to speak their mother tongue, right? They hear something, like the little boy hearing his sister tell him the story. He couldn't repeat the whole story word for word because he didn't have all the vocabulary and grammar structures, but he took the words that he knew, that he had learned, and he re-summarized that story in his own words, and he retold it several times to practice what he was learning. So you can do the same thing to learn to speak in English, okay? If you hear a story, you've practiced it, you've imitated it, and you want to reproduce it, don't worry about saying the whole story perfectly. Just like when you first learn a song, you aren't going to immediately turn off the CD and sing the song perfectly. You're going to sing maybe the chorus and the parts you remember, then you'll have to go back and listen to it again, and then, keep singing it until you can sing the whole song from beginning to end. Same thing with your stories in English. You can retell the story in your own words, summarize it in your own words, using the words the structures the pronunciation then go back, listen to it again, and then try retelling it again later. And each time you do that, you'll get better and better. Okay? And then there's also some alteration exercises. This is great, especially if you have a dialogue. After you've practiced it for a while, then you can repeat and practice with a friend, you being person A and your friend being person B, if you have people in your personal English network, and then vice versa, practice alternating each of the parts as if you were speaking with someone in English. Okay, so that's basically it for the exercises that you can do. These, like I said, if you're listening to the audio, you can pause it for most of these. So if you're listening to a phrase, you pause it, repeat it, go back, listen to it again if you need to. One of the best English speakers I ever met learned English this way using movies, old John Wayne movies. He'd watch the movies until he learned them well. Then he would go back and watch them again and pause it. He would say the part, then listen to it again to hear, compare his pronunciation with what he had heard, and then he would listen to it again, and then he would repeat it a second time, okay? I think I got that right. Let me try that again. He would watch the movie, he'd hear a part, he'd pause it, he'd say it, he'd listen to it again, and then he'd say it a second time because, each time he would improve his pronunciation and speak more correctly, just like the actor, the person he was listening to, and his English pronunciation was almost perfect. So these are things that you can do to develop your speaking skills, okay? So get an audio, listen to it, pause it, practice using these different exercises and drills. Some of these drills you may have to prepare ahead of time, like, for example, maybe the fill-in-the-blank exercises. You'd have to pause it and then have a blank in there. So some of these you may have to have someone prepare for you. We have several of these exercises that we've prepared for our students in the VIP English Club to go along with the mini-story lessons and the different exercises that we've created there. So if you want some of these already created, these are exercises and mini-story that we've developed for our students here locally in the school, and we've made those available online as well because a lot of people were asking us to make that material available. So if you don't want to have all the work of going through and creating some of these on your own, then you can just join the VIP English Club, become a member there, and get access to these same lessons and exercises each week. Okay? So that's basically it. Let me see if there's anything else that I'm forgetting here. I don't think so. So, you can read more about this. There's actually a post on the video called post on the blog called How Do You Speak English? So you can go ahead and read through that. If you'd like a review of what you just heard here in this video, download the worksheets, go ahead and work through that, practice some of those on your own. And just remember, basically, if you want to learn to develop your speaking skills, it's going to be just like you learn to listen to music. So you're going to listen to it, you're going to imitate it, sing along with the song, and then eventually produce it on your own. Same thing with your English. Listen to the language, a story, a dialogue, imitate it, learn those vocabulary words, sentence structures, pronunciation, expressions, and then follow along, repeat along, practice, saying it until you get to the point where you can reproduce it simultaneously and then produce it on your own. Okay, so go ahead. If you haven't seen the other videos, there's 2 more videos that we've already recorded for you. The next one will be talking about developing your personal English network, creating a network of people that you can speak English with. Stay tuned. If you'd like to subscribe to the blog, to our newsletter, to our YouTube channel, Twitter account, Facebook, you can find us pretty easily online, and we look forward to helping you speak English. So that's pretty much it. God bless you all. Have a good day, and bye-bye.